Hello everybody and welcome back. Good to talk to all of you again today and welcome to another Know Your Ship episode. Today's episode is probably going to be a little bit shorter than some of the other ones, but I think it will be an interesting one nonetheless. Now this episode is basically inspired, shall we say, by a visit out to Halifax last week. And when I was there, I had a friend and I was like, hey, could we go somewhere kind of scenic, somewhere where I could take some photos? And it was like, sure, we could go to Point Pleasant Park. And when I went there, I found the Halifax Memorial, which is basically a memorial to the men and women of the Navy, Army, and Merchant Navy of Canada during the First and Second World Wars, whose graves are unknown. So these are people who, died at sea, things like that. By the way, it's a beautiful park, and when I was there, another cool thing was there was actually even like abandoned Second World War bunkers and everything. It's actually a pretty cool place to just kind of go and see a bit of history. But anyways, the inscription on the monument says, in honor of the men and women of the Navy, Army, and Merchant Navy of Canada, whose names are inscribed here, their graves are unknown, but their memory shall endure. So I kind of walked around the memorial, looked at the various plaques, and I came to one 1940, and it was a really long list of names, by the way. And the first one at the very, very top was Commander Joseph W. R. Roy. And I was like, you know what? I want to know what happened to this particular person. And thank God for smartphones, so I was able to look it up, and I found out the story of his ship, the HMCS Margaree. And this is where we're going to start today's Know Your Ship episode. Well, actually not really, because before we talk about that particular ship, which started life as HMS Diana, a D-class destroyer, we do have to talk about the C-class destroyers first, right? Because this is an episode about C and D-class destroyers. So first we're going to talk about a different destroyer, which is HMS Crescent, one of the C-class destroyers. Now, the C and D-class destroyers were a new generation of destroyers, and they were built by the British after the British realized that their counterparts, rivals, if you want to call them that, like the Germans and Italians, were building bigger and more capable destroyers. British destroyers at the time were still mostly older World War I era units, and those ships weren't going to be really competitive. So they needed ships that would better match up to their foreign counterparts. The ships were built between 1930 and 1933, the C and D class, by the way, and they were basically the same ship. The only major differences was that the D-class destroyers carried ASDIC and depth charges instead of the two-speed destroyer sweep minesweeping gear that the C-class carried. In terms of specifications, the ships came in just a hair under 1,400 tons standard, were 100.3 meters long, had a 10.1 meter beam, and a 3.8 meter draft. The ships generated 36,000 shaft horsepower and were capable of doing 36 knots. Their range of 10,870 kilometers at 15 knots was quite considerable, and if you were to sort of consider the size of the British Empire, it certainly made sense. If you were to compare that range to comparable German destroyers at the time, the British destroyers had close to 4 times the range. C and D class destroyers were not equipped with radar until after World War II had broken out. However, the ships that I'm going to focus my story on today were not equipped with radar at all. Both C and D class destroyers came equipped with 4 quick-firing 4.7-inch Mark 9 guns. They could elevate to a maximum of 40 degrees on later ships, but on the C and D classes, they could only be elevated to 30 degrees. That gave the guns a maximum range of 14,400 meters. Their low elevations meant that the main guns could not be used against aircraft. The guns fired high explosive and semi-armor piercing shells and could manage about 6 to 10 rounds a minute. The semi-armor piercing rounds could penetrate 2.5 inches of armor at around 6,000 meters. The main guns were controlled by an Admiralty Fire Control Clock Mark I, however, the AA guns were aimed solely by the eye. The ships did mount some AA weaponry, but it was completely inadequate, and this weakness would be demonstrated on numerous occasions, as 4 out of the 9 D-class destroyers would be bombed and sunk during World War II. The ships were equipped with 2 quadruple torpedo launchers, very standard fit for what the British considered fleet destroyers. Anyways, let's move on to the actual stories of these two ships. So let's start with HMS Crescent. She was laid down December 1st, 1930, commissioned into service 21st April 1932. She spent some time with the 2nd Destroyer Flotilla of the Home Fleet, and at the beginning of 1934, she'd spent 3 months in the West Indies. Further deployments occurred during the Abyssinian Crisis, which is the war between Italy and Ethiopia, and this was followed by deployments to the Indian Ocean and the Red Sea. On the 20th of October 1936, Crescent, along with her sister ship Signet, were sold to the Royal Canadian Navy. Now, Crescent was renamed HMCS Fraser and was assigned to Canadian Pacific Command. On the 31st of August 1939, a day before the outbreak of World War II, she was ordered to the Atlantic. She undertook escort duty for ships sailing out of Halifax, and she was sent over to Europe as an escort for the 1st Canadian Infantry Division in late 1939. In June of 1940, she was sent to evacuate Allied troops from various French ports on the Atlantic coast. On the 25th of June, she was rammed and sunk by the cruiser HMS Calcutta while evacuating refugees that were trapped by the German army in France. Calcutta cut the Fraser in two, and she sank immediately. 45 sailors would lose their lives in that sinking. So now our story shifts to HMS Diana. This D-class destroyer was laid down 12 June 1931 and commissioned into service on the 21st of December 1932. She spent the majority of her career in the Far East. Now, with the outbreak of World War II, she was transferred first to the Mediterranean Fleet and then to the Home Fleet's 3rd Destroyer Flotilla. During the Norwegian campaign, she served as an escort and participated in the evacuations from Norway when the country fell. On the 4th of September 1940, she was formally commissioned into the Royal Canadian Navy as the HMCS Margaree, and she was a replacement for the sunk HMCS Fraser. Now, 1 month after starting her service in the Royal Canadian Navy, Margaree was escorting a convoy, OL-8. That evening, the weather deteriorated really badly, and around midnight of the 21st, the Margaree had completely lost track of the convoy. At 1 a.m. in the morning on the 22nd of October, Margaree suddenly cut in front of the MV Port Ferry. Collision was totally unavoidable. An almost exact repeat of the loss of the HMCS Fraser, the Port Ferry's bow cut the Margaree into just under the bridge. The front portion of the ship sank almost immediately. 6 officers and 28 ratings on the rear of the ship survived the initial collision. 32 of those would escape onto the MV Port Ferry, but 2 survivors of the initial collision would slip from the ropes and be crushed between the 2 ships. Of the 176 men aboard the ship, 142 of them would perish, including the ship's commander, Joseph W.R. Roy. The story is even more tragic when you consider the fact that out of the 142 men that were lost on the Margaree, 86 of them have been survivors from the Fraser, which had sunk only a few months earlier. Anyways, that's the interesting story for today. Hope you enjoyed this Know Your Ship episode. Until next time, folks, take care of yourselves and be safe out there.